listen to this silence. A silence not of peace, but of a quiet end. On a hidden corner of Lindley Street, Bridgeport, Connecticut, those massive red brick buildings stand there like ghosts of a lost era. The windows are shattered. Weeds push up through cracks in the concrete floor, and late afternoon sunlight slants in through a rusted archway, spilling light into a space that, decades ago, was once the pounding heart of North American manufacturing. This place once defined what the standard even meant. There was a time, if you walked into almost any machine shop, from New York all the way to Singapore, you'd see the name Bridgeport raised into the industrial gray cast iron body of the machine. It was an empire so great, its name stopped being just a brand. It became the everyday word people used for a whole class of versatile milling machines all around the world. The standard, that's what the world called them.
Our market today is growing around the globe. Bridgeport enjoys a strong and growing presence, the world's second largest machine tool market region, with over 37% of the world's purchases. South America and the Far East have also become.
But look at this spot on the map today. Their most iconic factory was dismantled in 2010. Why would a giant that held the soul of the machine shop, with machines made to last, still running after 70 years, collapse so tragically in the transition to digital technology? And why did a legacy of absolute precision end in debt, bankruptcy, and the hush of the silent shop? The core question in this investigation isn't just about bankruptcy. It's about a cruel paradox. Did yesterday's perfection become tomorrow's death sentence? An empire that, in a way, signed its own fate with its very glory. And this is where the story turns, in a direction no one saw coming. Bridgeport machines didn't begin in a glass office or in a $1 million R&D lab. It began with the hands of a Swedish immigrant, hands coated in sawdust and machine oil. Rudolph Bannow, born in 1897 in Göteborg, came to America at age 13 with empty hands. His life embodies a chapter of history in which pattern makers were the quiet architects who built the physical foundations of the world. Yes, he was a great pattern maker, and he believed in one thing: iron had to last. But that belief was quietly setting the stage for a tragedy. Picture Bannow at 14, an apprentice at the Dean Steam Pump Company, earning just 6.5 cents an hour. His mother had to take in boarders, working men, just to scrape together a little more money. It was a hard beginning. 5 years later, he made his way to Bridgeport, Connecticut, a heavy industry hub back then, home to famous names like Remington Arms and General Electric. Bannow wasn't just another worker. He was a true craftsman of machines. In 1927, he bought a small pattern shop with $80 in savings and $3,000 borrowed from his mother. Back then, machining was still a kind of hands-on art, something you could feel in the work, in the steady skill of a person's hands. He met Magnus Wallström, another Swedish immigrant, and together they began to build their own dynasty. The fateful moment came in 1936. Bannow was sitting in a delivery truck, and right there, on a simple paper bag, he sketched out the idea for the world's first turret milling machine. This design let the spindle head swivel and tilt, moving with freedom along a sturdy column, turning one machine into an all-purpose knife. A machine that could handle almost anything, drilling holes, boring them true, and cutting complex slots. In 1938, the machine with serial number 1 rolled out of the factory. It didn't take long before it became the standard for the entire industry. Bannow had made a strategic leap from being a parts supplier to becoming a machine builder, setting the architecture standard for a whole class of versatile milling machines. On the shop floor, Bannow cut a solid figure, smooth white hair, and English spoken with a faint Swedish lilt. He didn't run the company from distant financial reports. When he wanted to test a new idea, he kept the habit of making a wooden or metal pattern himself. Right there, with his own hands. To him, Bridgeport Machines was a family, a working man's company. And he was proud the company didn't need a union, because he paid above the average and shared profits with the people who'd put in 5 years of service. It was a kind of social pact built on personal reputation, a world where the precision of the machines walked side by side with the loyalty of the people. Everything seemed made to last. The machines, the men and women, even the profits. They set the standard for the whole world. Just about every machine shop wanted a Bridgeport. The business grew fast, almost unbelievably fast. By 1960, the New York Times reported the company was worth around $6.5 million. And on the line, they could turn out one machine every 20 minutes. For a heavy machine tool, that kind of speed was something to behold. People truly believed this dynasty would last forever. But immortality was the first illusion of collapse. If Bannow was the creative soul, then Magnus Wahlström was the mind that turned those sketches into reality and scaled them for the factory floor. Wahlström was the man who kept the line running on time. A quiet engineer manager, not a man of many words, steady and calm as he expanded production, guiding the company into the world of mass industrial manufacturing. In 1967, the 100,000th machine rolled out of the factory. It was the bright golden age of American machining. But while they were busy pouring their finest cast iron, shaping it into something close to perfect, the world was already shifting toward a new set of rules. Rules where good iron wasn't everything anymore. Why did an empire miss the moment? Why did the best craftsmen end up becoming the most outdated? A ghost was crossing the ocean, a ghost with a name, CNC. Why would a product that's too good end up destroying the company that made it? That's the heart of the Bridgeport Paradox. They built something made to last, so long-lasting that many customers simply didn't need to buy another one. Bridgeport built its machines to outlast the machinist standing at the controls. They used the finest cast iron and hand-scraped the ways, those sliding surfaces, to hold lubricating oil and keep wear down to a minimum. Their catalog even bragged about it. High resale value and long-term reliability. Before, durability was their unbeatable weapon. After, durability became the wall that kept customers from upgrading to new technology. The reversal came from something simple. The American market was flooded with used machines that still ran almost too well. So demand for new machines dropped hard, right as the digital wave began knocking at the door. A legacy built to endure, that turned into a slow-moving engine of decline. Take a look at these grim numbers, and you'll see how the standard became a burden. In 1973, only 33% of the machine tools in use in the United States were less than 10 years old. By 1978, as much as 40% of the machinery was already more than 20 years old. Meanwhile, in Japan, around that same time, the machine fleet was much younger. Only 18% of machines were over 20 years old. Japanese companies replaced their machinery far faster than American firms did. Why? Because they understood something important. In the CNC era, A machine is no longer something you simply stockpile and hold on to. It's a performance tool, and it has to be kept current again and again. American factories and job shops had a different habit. They'd repair a machine to death. They kept old equipment going through maintenance, retrofits, and replacement parts, instead of scrapping it and buying something new. On one hand, it spoke to the high-maintenance skill of American machinists, but on the other, it stretched the machine's economic life out for decades. And for Bridgeport, that carried a brutal implication. In practice, every machine they'd successfully sold in the past could mean one less customer for the next 30 years, effectively taken out of the market. Yes, customers loved Bridgeport. And yes, they believed in the standard. But that loyalty didn't generate the cash flow needed for an expensive race in technology. When CNC arrived, many American machinists didn't rush to buy a whole new lineup of Bridgeport machines. Instead, they'd pick up a few CNC machines from Japan for production runs, and keep their old mechanical Bridgeports for support work, fixture and mold repairs, and one-off setups. The great milling machine was pushed into the corner of the shop, becoming the old master of the trade. Dependable, still standing, but stepping back as faster, cheaper Japanese machines took the lead. Picture an American machine shop in the 1980s. A baseball game on the radio, blending with the steady, rhythmic hum of a milling machine. It's the sound of comfort, but underneath that comfort, there's a quiet kind of stagnation. American machinists took pride in keeping a machine running for 40 years. They didn't realize that while they were carefully scraping the ways on an old machine, their competitors across the ocean were turning out 10 times the output, powered by modular CNC machines that could be delivered in just a few weeks. The quality trap snapped shut. Bridgeport had become too good at filling the market with its own made-to-last legacy. Without meaning to, they created a natural barrier to their own revenue. And as the rules of the business shifted toward whoever could sell the next generation, machines that were cheaper and easier to run, Bridgeport found itself stuck in a market flooded with old blocks of cast iron, machines that still ran almost too well. The standard had started to feel like a haunting ghost. It could remind everyone of a golden industrial age, but it couldn't pay the expensive R&D bills of the microprocessor era. So, what happens when the brain of the machine matters more than the body? When the industry's common language is no longer Swedish or New England English, but command lines coming from the East? While American machinists stayed busy at the handwheels, a new giant named Fanuc was quietly building a digital Tower of Babel, a place where machines all over the world began speaking one common language, except Bridgeport. As the 1970s began, the global machine tool industry witnessed a major power shift from hardwired NC to microprocessor-controlled CNC. This is when the rules of technology changed for good, from good iron to a control ecosystem. Machine tools were no longer just solid blocks of cast iron. They began to need a smarter brain. In the United States, every machine builder, even the biggest names, developed or used a different control system. It created a fragmented world, where each machine was its own lonely island. A machinist might learn the programming language for one machine, then step over to another, and suddenly he'd feel technically illiterate. That fragmentation made training expensive, and maintenance a costly nightmare. Meanwhile, in Japan, a common language was established early on. Fanuc arrived and quickly became the de facto standard for CNC controllers worldwide. Japanese builders, from Mazak to Morisiki, designed their machines around Fanuc's standard platform. And that advantage created a powerful network effect. Every Japanese machine sold meant one more machinist who knew the Japanese system. The more machines that went out the door, the more training materials appeared, the wider the service network grew, and the lower the marginal costs dropped. Before, whoever cast the best machine body won. After, whoever controlled the standard and the ecosystem of trained machinists ruled the market. The mechanism was simple. Fanuc focused almost entirely on the controller, until it became the common standard for the whole industry. So, other machine builders could simply plug in and run. A new standard had just brought down the standard. Bridgeport machines didn't ignore CNC. They developed their own control system, BOSS, Bridgeport Operating System Software, for their machine line. The catalogs of the time described BOSS as a dedicated computer system, with software stored in ROM, supporting linear interpolation and packaged milling cycles. Yes, it was technically powerful. But yes, it was also a deadly mistake. Because BOSS was only a local dialect, just as Fanuc was becoming the world's industrial English. Look at it from the machinist's point of view. Buying a machine that ran on BOSS meant you had to retrain your whole crew. And you couldn't take advantage of the workforce that was already fluent in standard Fanuc. In a way, old hardware pride may have made Bridgeport slow to take software and the user interface seriously. They still seemed to think in the old order. Build the best milling machine first, then figure out how to add the brain afterward. The real numbers show you just how unforgiving this new set of rules was. In 1975, Japan officially overtook the United States to become the world's largest producer of CNC lathes. By the early 1980s, Japan held over 60% of the global market for CNC lathes, while the United States was down to only around 10%. And that push hit hardest in the basic and mid-range CNC machines. The very home turf, the sole territory, that Bridgeport had always counted on. The Japanese weren't just strong in technology, they were strong in product strategy too. They used modular design to cut costs and shorten delivery times. So when demand surged after the downturn, a Japanese machine could arrive at a shop in just a few weeks. While American builders were still tied to complex, expensive machines, with customers waiting 1 to 2 years. Bridgeport had already filled the market with durable old machines, and now it was facing competitors selling new ones that were cheaper, easier to run, and faster to deliver. The gold standard began to rust under the heat of standardized code from the East. The standard, once so celebrated, was now trapped between a past that lasted too long and a future that moved too fast. But the real disaster didn't come only from outside the borders. It was already taking root inside the financial boardrooms of America's billion-dollar conglomerates. On March 1, 1968, something happened that changed Bridgeport's DNA forever. Selling out to the diversified conglomerate Textron looked like a move for more capital, a way to bring in fresh money. But in reality, it was the beginning of a tragic process, the milking of assets. To understand why Bridgeport machines fell, we have to leave the oil-soaked shop floor and step into the carpeted boardrooms of giant corporations. In 1968, Bridgeport Machines Incorporated was sold to Textron Incorporated. It marked the beginning of a darker chapter in American corporate history. The conglomerate wave, because the engine driving a diversified conglomerate like Textron was completely different from men like Bannow, a pattern maker, a builder, a craftsman. They didn't buy Bridgeport machines out of love for the sound of steel being cut. They bought it to diversify a portfolio. They wanted to use the steady cash flow of a leading machine tool company to fuel mergers and acquisitions in other, trendier industries. Under Textron's ownership, Bridgeport slowly became a dependent unit inside a group called Machine Tools and Precision Bearings. The management logic was no longer, how do we build the best milling machine for the future? It became, how do we maximize short-term profit for the conglomerate's consolidated financial reports? This was management by spreadsheet, a world where engineers were pushed aside and accountants took the wheel. Research by CPES came to a bitter conclusion. The American machine tool industry failed to sustain a steady, cumulative investment in innovation. And every time a recession hit, the pattern repeated. Instead of sticking with R&D to protect long-term leadership, conglomerates like Textron chose cuts. They reduced research budgets, let go of their most talented engineers, and sold off assets just to make the profit numbers look better. This is the third pivot, trading the soul for the numbers. Before, a company led by its founder and by industrial builders with a decades-long vision. After, a financialized asset on a balance sheet. With R&D being worn down at the very moment Japan was accelerating. In the end, industry became a hostage to the stock market. Compare this deadly difference. While Textron treated Bridgeport machines like a cash cow, milking its steady cash flow to fund acquisitions like Avco Corp., Japanese and German rivals were still in the hands of industrial families or tightly linked industrial groups. They had long-term credit relationships with banks, and they were willing to endure cycles of losses to build domestic capability before exports took off. They invested in people. American conglomerates invested in deals. The conglomerate ownership structure made Bridgeport Machines miss its golden window to reinvent itself for the digital age. When the 1981 to 1982 recession hit, Textron's machine tool division took heavy losses. And instead of backing its subsidiary through the storm, the conglomerate chose to put Bridgeport Machines up for sale, like an asset that was no longer worth squeezing. Bannow had once pushed back against bureaucracy, complaining that to start a business these days, you needed too many lawyers and too many accountants. Now, it reads like a painful prophecy. Down on the shop floor, the men were still wiping down those hand-scraped ways, still made to last. But up above, the soul of the company was being torn apart. Between lifeless financial reports, in 1985, a management team led by Joseph Clancy carried out an MBO, a management buyout, to win back independence. But what they got back was a kingdom already worn down, buried under debt. And most of all, they had lost the trust of the very workers who had built the standard. Clancy stepped in as the captain in the middle of the CNC storm, with a mountain of debt on his shoulders. But the biggest test didn't come from the bankers on Wall Street. It came from the strike line itself. Angry machinists right there on Lindley Street. Rudolph Bannow was a hero in the eyes of his workers. He had carried a union card for 10 years before becoming an owner. Under his leadership, Bridgeport Machines had no union. Not because he forbade it, but because the workers saw no need for one. They were paid well. They received a $400 gift every year, each one. And most of all, they trusted a social pact built on the shop owner's personal reputation. But a quarter-century later, the world had changed. When Joseph Clancy led the MBO in 1985, he wasn't just buying back machines. He was buying a debt-heavy asset, loaded with LBO financing, a leveraged buyout. Clancy was the kind of CEO shaped by the financialized age, a man coming out of boardrooms with bankers, not out of a pattern shop. The break came immediately. Just days after the MBO was completed, Bridgeport Machines workers voted to unionize under the Teamsters. Why? Because they could feel the ghost of uncertainty. They no longer saw a Bannow standing among the machines, shirt sleeves rolled up. What they saw instead was a leadership team trying to optimize the balance sheet, right as Japanese competition was squeezing profit margins. In 1986, 220 workers formed a picket line and began a strike for better benefits. It was a painful contrast. In the 1950s, Bannow told the NAM he spoke for the little guy. But 30 years later, Clancy had to stand at a picket line, just to keep production going. Clancy's strategy was tough and deeply pragmatic. He rolled up his sleeves and went down to the shop floor with 128 temporary workers, just to keep the line from stopping. He even walked the picket line himself, talking directly with the workers. In the end, the workers agreed to leave the Teamsters and return under a non-union arrangement. Picture how a labor relationship changed. In Bannow's time, it was like a straight line from the owner's heart to the worker's hands. But in Clancy's time, it became something else, a complicated triangle. Bankers at the top, the stock market on one corner, and the workers on the other. Profits were no longer stockpiled in inventory to protect jobs like they had been during the 1957-58 downturn. Now, profits had to be prioritized to pay interest on leveraged debt. Even though Clancy won an operational victory, he lost something you can't put on a balance sheet: the unity behind the standard. A famous machine tool company, born from the hands of small craftsmen, was now slowly dying, caught between financialization and internal conflict. And the best machinists began to leave Lindley Street. Some were laid off, others quit, worn down and discouraged. So, where did these master machinists take the secrets behind the gold standard? Straight into the hands of Bridgeport's younger, hungrier rivals. Companies with no 70-year legacy to brag about, but with a burning desire to redefine the future of American machining. Before we step into the darkness, remember what created the standard. Bridgeport Machines wasn't just a company. It was the soul of New England industry. An empire built from Rudolph Bannow's sketch on a paper bag and Magnus Wallström's lightning-fast ability to scale it into mass production. They built machines made to last, so durable they became the standard in machine shops around the world. Yes, they dominated the era of manual machines. And yes, they believed good iron was the one silver bullet. But while they were absorbed in those carefully hand-scraped ways, the rules quietly changed hands. Japan unleashed Fanuc, a common language for the world, turning America's fragmented control islands into outdated relics. And as the glory of the Series 1 manual mill became a revenue trap because customers wouldn't buy new machines, Bridgeport began to crack. Those cracks led straight to the gates of diversified conglomerates, where industrial craft was quietly killed off by short-term financial reports. Textron didn't buy Bridgeport machines to build a better milling machine. They bought it for the cash flow. In the conglomerate playbook, Bridgeport Machines was just an asset. An asset code meant to diversify a portfolio. And the mechanism of collapse was almost silent. It happened in carpeted boardrooms in Rhode Island, far removed from the noise of the shop floor. Bridgeport Machines was no longer run by pattern makers who understood how cast iron and steel expand. It was run by people who understood how debt expands. Bridgeport moved from an industrial company led by builders to a subsidiary inside a financial empire. Before, profits could be used to stockpile inventory and protect machinist skill through a crisis. After, cash flow was redirected to fund the parent company's other M&A deals, while Bridgeport's CNC capability was left falling behind. The reversal was simple. Short-term profit was prioritized over long-term technological health. It was a tombstone built out of money. Look at what happened from 1968 to 1978. While Japan was pouring money into microprocessors and standardizing control systems, the real book value of assets across America's machine tool companies fell by nearly 50%. Textron drained Bridgeport machines. They treated it like a cash cow, something to squeeze and liquidate to raise capital for other deals, like Avco Corp. How do you win the brain race when research budgets get pushed back after every quarterly earnings report? Bridgeport Machines was good at running factories, good at designing manual machines, but they were blind to the new rules of capital. Their hands were tied by a structure that wouldn't allow short-term losses, even if it meant buying a future. This is no longer a story about Bannow's creative paper bag sketches. This is a story about cracks in the management system. Cracks where the ghost of silence began to spread. And when debt replaced innovation, another geographic trap was already waiting, ready to deliver the final blow to the soul of New England. Do you believe in luck in business? Bridgeport Machines didn't anymore after 1980. A perfect macro storm hit, and it didn't forgive any delay. Look at the early 1980s macro picture. Interest rates were sky high, and the US dollar was absurdly strong. Those two forces made imported Japanese machines relatively cheaper, while American companies couldn't borrow the money to invest in new equipment. It was a 1-2 knockout for the capital equipment industry. In Japan, the game was designed very differently. They had more than 20 years of deliberate intervention. Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, protected the domestic market to build CNC capability, supported credit, and pushed accelerated depreciation, so Japanese shops could keep a younger, more up-to-date fleet of machines. And in the United States, there was no equivalent program. In 1983, a National Research Council report offered a bitter self-critique. America was slow to adopt microprocessor-based controllers, slow to standardize, and lacked coordinated public-private investment. We left the standard to swim on its own. In the floodwaters of free trade, the penetration came with the speed of an invasion. In 1973, foreign machines held only 10% of the U.S. market. Just 10 years later, by the mid-1980s, that number had surged to 60%. And here's the most frightening number of all. 75% of NC and CNC machines sold in the United States at the time were imports, and half of those came from Japan. The home market changed hands. Before, Bridgeport dominated America's job shops with standard manual machines. After, Japanese builders took over the basic and mid-range CNC segment with standardized machines that were cheaper, durable, and readily available. The reversal came from one advantage. Japan solved the cost and delivery time problem through modular design. It was the trap of complacency. When demand surged after the downturn, Japanese builders could deliver new machines in just a few weeks because they already had a ready-made catalog of standard models. Meanwhile, Bridgeport Machines, and many American builders, were still stuck with complex, expensive machines and slow delivery times, shaped by the habit of building custom orders for big plants. American factories and job shops, Bridgeport's core customers, were forced into a practical choice. They couldn't wait 1 to 2 years for an expensive machine. So they bought Japanese machines. They bought speed. They bought an ecosystem of machinists already fluent in the FANUC standard. And in the end, FANUC's industrial English beat Bridgeport's local dialect, boss. But Bridgeport Machines didn't accept defeat. they decided to make one last all-in bet to win back their profit margins. A bet called Made in the South. What they didn't realize was this: leaving the New England cradle was the moment they cut their last lifeline to the Standard. Look at this map of desperation. In 1981, Bridgeport Machines made the decision to move production. They built a massive 200,000 square foot plant in Greenville, Mississippi. On paper, Greenville looked like a dream. Low taxes, low wages, no union. Leadership hoped it would be the weapon to bring the milling machine's cost down, low enough to go head-to-head with Japan. But they forgot one thing: Bridgeport Machines wasn't built on iron alone. It was built on people. Look at the mechanism of this failure. New England had generations of machinists. People who could feel an error of 1/1000th of an inch, just from the vibration in a handwheel. Greenville didn't. It was a land of catfish farms and cotton fields. So Bridgeport Machines had to spend millions of dollars and thousands of hours training new workers from zero. And that hand-scraped quality, the very thing that made the Standard, slowly turned into something lifeless. Assembly without a soul. And then there was the logistics trap. Greenville sat as much as 75 miles away from any major interstate highway. Cast iron blanks and electronic circuit boards had to travel thousands of miles across the country by truck. In the end, it seemed the freight costs could swallow up every penny they thought they'd saved on wages. The disintegration of American manufacturing capability. Before, an ecosystem of skilled machinists centered in the industrial cradle. After, a factory modern on paper but hollowed out of real-world skill in Mississippi. The reversal lay in the disregard for accumulated knowledge and the money-san, the prioritization of geographic cost-cutting. The result was a disaster of trust. Hardcore machinists started complaining about the quality of machines labeled "Made in Greenville." Machines that were 80 years old still ran well, but brand new machines coming off the line showed control problems and rigidity that didn't live up to what people expected. That legendary durability became a bitter irony. Some customers began to say, "I'd rather buy an old Bridgeport and retrofit it than buy a new machine from Mississippi." Bridgeport had saturated the market with machines that were too durable. And when they tried to sell a new product that was inferior, the market punished them in the most unforgiving way. The silence of the silent shop wasn't just the silence of machines. It was the silence of a standard that had been quietly swapped out. In its final hours, Bridgeport Machines made one last surge. A management buyout, MBO, to win back freedom from Textron. But could a kingdom that had already lost its most elite soldiers still fight with a mountain of debt on its back? The year was 1985. Joseph Clancy emerged as the helmsman in the heart of the storm. As president of the Bridgeport division under Textron, he knew that without action, this icon would be carved up to pay the debts of its parent company. Clancy made a fateful decision, a management buyout. He and his management team, with support from E.F. Hutton, took on massive debt to buy 67% of Bridgeport from Textron for $77 million. On the symbolic level, it was a heroic uprising. They wanted to reclaim the identity of a machine tool company from short-term financial logic. But in practical terms, it was suicide by financial leverage. Look at this contrast. Rudolph Bannow in the 1950s stands among the machines, sleeves rolled up, speaking like a master craftsman. Joseph Clancy in the 1980s stands in a boardroom, with sales charts sliding downward. In front of him sit creditors and bankers from Wall Street. And the conflict erupted immediately. Just days after they won back independence, Bridgeport Machines workers voted to unionize under the Teamsters. A year later, the strike broke out. Clancy had to choose an extremely hard-line strategy. He rolled up his sleeves and went down to the shop floor with 128 temporary workers to keep production going. At the same time, he walked the picket line himself to speak directly with the workers. It was an effort to reconnect the old dialogue of the Bannow era, but in a time when trust had completely collapsed. In the end, the workers agreed to leave the union. It was a strategic win for Clancy, but it made the shift in the labor relations unmistakably clear. Bridgeport Machines was no longer a family. It was an asset weighed down by debt. To raise the capital to pay down debt and invest, Clancy was forced to optimize the balance sheet. He cut costs, restructured, and eventually listed the stock on NASDAQ in 1994. He tried to diversify the product line by acquiring JPAX EDM and Yasuda HMC, but the Boss Island was still alone. How can you convince the market to use a proprietary operating system when machinists around the world already see FANUC as must-have? The competitor's network effect was simply too strong. Every FANUC machine that got sold made Bridgeport look harder to use in the eyes of new customers. By this point, Bridgeport Machines was like a milling machine trying to run at full power, with a loose spindle. It was an image of financial exhaustion. They no longer had the strength to make real technological leaps. They were only trying to survive. The final breaths of an independent empire were growing shorter. In 2002, the final hammer blow came down. But the legacy of Bridgeport Machines wouldn't disappear entirely. It would become a sad echo in the language of the machine trade. The year was 2002. The name Bridgeport Machines Incorporated officially disappeared from the map of independent ownership. With the unit in England going bankrupt, Hardinge bought all of the company's assets. Production gradually shifted to New York, and the once renowned Bridgeport Machines brand became just a product line in someone else's catalog. The Lindley Street plant was demolished sometime around 2010. If you go back there today, you'll only see empty lots overrun with weeds. And you'll see the old Remington Arms buildings too, icons of industrial ruin porn. But here's the final paradox, and Bannow's saddest kind of glory. Bridgeport Machines lost the business war, but they won something else. They won the right to define a technical form for humanity. Look at almost any machine shop in Europe or Asia. You still see tens of thousands of milling machines with that unmistakable knee mill shape. Tall cast-iron bodies, a ram-head spindle. Those machines may be made by companies most people have never heard of, but machinists still call them Bridgeport-style machines. Bridgeport Machines became an archetype, a template copied by countless rivals. Their invisible legacy is still enormous. Hundreds of thousands of Series 1 machines are still running, in DIY machining garages and in trade schools. For machinists, makers, and restorers, Bridgeport Machines is still a symbol of an era of real iron, real skill. They value the scratched aluminum tag on the machine, like a certificate of pure mechanical precision. The machine was made to last, but the company wasn't. The death of Bridgeport Machines. Machines is a classic case of how even the best can lose. They were great at iron and steel, but they lost at the ecosystem level and the bigger rules of the game. They created a standard, and then, in a way, that same standard may have kept them trapped in the past. The silence of that red brick factory in Connecticut wasn't a random ending. It was a warning. It reminds every business that the standard of yesterday can become the chains of tomorrow if you aren't brave enough to break it yourself. The Bridgeport Machines legend has gone quiet, leaving behind the faint clatter of hand cranks in small garages around the world, echoes of a lost era. When we look at the ruins of Lindley Street, we're not only seeing the collapse of a company, we're seeing the end of an era when we believed that making the best product in the world would be enough to survive, and that belief may not have been enough. The story of Bridgeport Machines leaves 3 bitter lessons for the future of manufacturing. First, the product paradox. Never build a revenue model on permanence if you don't control the technology upgrade cycle. Bridgeport Machines sold customers a machine made to last 40 years, but they couldn't sell them a reason to upgrade the brain of that machine. Second, the hardware success trap. In the digital age, outstanding mechanical craft is only the starting point. What wins is the ability to build a standardized ecosystem, a shared language the whole world can learn and use. A milling machine that's the best in its class, but speaks a lonely, local language called BOSS, will lose to a machine that's good enough and speaks FANUC's industrial English. Third, management matters more than legacy. Being acquired by a diversified conglomerate should have provided the capital for the CNC leap, but short-term management eroded the ability to renew, just as Japan accelerated. Bannow's legacy was diluted by debt and by financial spreadsheets far removed from the reality of the shop floor. Next time you walk past a machine shop and hear the hand crank of an old Bridgeport, stop for a moment. Listen to steel scraping on metal. That's the sound of an era when we believed a standard could stay unchanged. A legend can live forever in a machinist's memory, but an empire has to live on relentless renewal. Let the silence of the last plant in Greenville be the final warning. Never fall asleep on the glory of an old standard. History never rewards the ones who were best at yesterday's rules. Bridgeport Machines. Real iron, real skill, and a real lesson for anyone still dreaming of a kingdom that never sets. In the end, the silence of the last factory spoke. To understand why machinists loved Bridgeport Machines so much, we have to talk about the feel of the hand crank. A skilled machinist will tell you, I can mill a part accurate to the 1,000th of an inch just by listening to the machine's vibration through my hands. It's a physical connection, a kind of communication between a person and iron that no touch screen can replace. In Bannow's era, the turret mill wasn't just a piece of capital equipment, it was an extension of personal skill. Every series die that rolled out of Lindley Street carried the pride of those New England master builders. They valued the industrial gray paint, the tall body, and that ram head spindle jutting out like a strong arm, ready to take on any block of metal. When the machinist community watches old archival footage, they aren't only looking at technique. They're looking at an era when labor was honored, when an apprentice could rise to become president of the National Manufacturers Association. That's why the collapse of Bridgeport Machine carries a deeper kind of pain. The pain of an American middle class built on oil and grease and cast iron and steel. The shift-change whistle on Lindley Street didn't just mark the time. It marked the steady rhythm of a stable industrial society. When that sound grew less frequent during the 1981 to 1982 downturn, what was lost wasn't only work shifts. It was an entire DNA of a trade, passed down through generations. Those red brick buildings are quiet now, but the memory of steel cutting will keep echoing in the minds of the machinists, who once saw Bridgeport machines as the standard of their lives. Look at the failure of the Boss control system from another angle. It was the trap of an isolated monopoly. In modern economics, the value of a technology product may not sit in the product alone. It may sit in how many people use it. Bridgeport Machines was so confident in its mechanical, the standard, that it believed customers would accept any language it put in front of them. Boss Control could integrate Boss software stored in ROM, which was very advanced at the time. But it was a closed language. By contrast, Japan's FANUC played an open game. They focused purely on the brain, the controller, and the servo motor, letting other builders plug that into their own machine bodies. That mechanism created a global ecosystem. When a shop bought a Mazak running FANUC, they knew they could hire machinists more easily, find training materials more easily, and count on parts being readily available. Bridgeport Machines built a wall around its own throne with the proprietary Boss system. It turned customers into prisoners of a fragmented ecosystem. Under the new rules of the CNC era, isolation may have been the quietest death sentence of all. You can't defeat a network with a single player, no matter how exceptional that player is. The collapse of Bridgeport Machines teaches us this. In a connected world, whoever controls an industry's shared language will control the future. Iron and steel can last 70 years. But if the brain can't speak industrial English, it may end in silence, left behind in an abandoned warehouse. The price of the silence in Greenville may be a costly lesson in managing by financial spreadsheets far removed from the real world. A lesson in decisions made from a distance. When you move a technology icon to a remote place 75 miles away from an interstate highway, you're not just moving machines. You're putting an entire supply chain into a bind. Every truck traveling thousands of miles across the continent to bring parts from Asia to Mississippi was a staggering waste of time and energy. Bridgeport Machines tried to solve a cost problem with geography, but they may have been defeated by the very logistics gridlock they helped create. And look at the human pain. In Greenville, machinists had to be trained again from zero in a region of agriculture. The real skill that Bannow once took pride in was diluted in industrial assembly processes that felt soulless. The machines leaving here carried the Bridgeport Machines name, but they no longer seemed to carry the quiet whisper of the old standard. The silence of the Greenville plant today doesn't just signal a bankrupt business. It signals the failure of a mindset that treated people and skill as variables, replaceable with lower wages. Bridgeport, Connecticut, lost a factory. But the world lost an engineering standard that had once been a point of pride for humanity. The silent shop stands like a gravestone for the arrogance of financial managers, the kind who believed they could milk a legend until not a single drop of its soul was left. The story of Bridgeport Machines is a mirror for every technology company at the top today. Are you holding a gold standard of your own? And are you protecting it so tightly that it becomes a barrier to your own evolution? Remember Bannow's paper bag. Greatness starts with simplicity and with truly understanding the customer. Bridgeport machines lost that when they stepped into boardrooms filled with lawyers and accountants. They stopped listening to the voices of the machinists at the controls and started listening to the voice of the stock market. When you build a product made to last, you may need the courage to break it yourself when the world demands a new standard. If you don't, a competitor will do it for you. And they won't be as kind about it. As the old machinists on Lindley Street, the final silence on Lindley Street in 2010, when the building was leveled, is a reminder of this: nothing is permanent in business. Not even cast iron and hand-scraped sliding ways. Only innovation and the ability to adapt are the one standard that can last. The Bridgeport machines empire collapsed, but the echoes from those old machines in DIY garages out there still remind us every day. Never let past success keep you from stepping into the future.